So those three things I want to just put out there, because I'm going to loosely talk about religions of demand, religions of desire, and I want to talk about religions of drive. So, religion of demand would be the idea, in a way, that there is the absolute God is out there as a supreme being. I'm going to do a good example of these, not bad examples, good examples. So there's a hyper presence, a reality out there that we can encounter that can satisfy us in some sort of way. The most powerful form of this idea is in mysticism. This is where my three things work least, so I'm going to problematize this in a second. But if you think about the mystics, someone like Julian of Norwich, or a contemporary thinker like Jean-Luc Marion, you have this idea that religious experience is a saturation experience. We are short-circuited by the overwhelming over-proximity of a hyper-reality. Jean-Luc Marion calls this counter-experience, because it's not an experience as such. It's a short-circuiting. It's an overwhelming awe that kind of is too much to grasp. And this is where the sublime comes in. So this is a very Kantian idea. So in the Kant's notion of the sublime, it is an encounter with something that overwhelms our conception and our ability to intuit, our ability to what's his terms for this? Intuition and sensory sensory overload in a way. Now he had two notions of the sublime. He called the mathematical sublime and the dynamic sublime. The mathematical sublime is when you're overwhelmed by something in the mind. So like infinity, thinking about what infinity is kind of overwhelming. You can have a concept of eternity, and you can have a concept of infinity, or you can have a concept of the number pi, but you're in a way having a concept of something that cannot be conceptualized. So it's kind of, when you really think about it, you can be overwhelmed. And then the dynamic sublime is more bodily. It's like in the midst of a great storm, feeling the tremor and the power of nature, and feeling the awe of being overwhelmed and the anxiety that comes from an experience that is too much. Right? This is connected to the early Freud's notion of trauma. A trauma, the original idea of trauma, seduction theory, was that a trauma is an overwhelming happening that the child cannot symbolize. You cannot put it into words. You can't alphabetize it. So it happens to you, but it's a too muchness, right? And so in the mystical tradition, the religious experience is a counter experience of saturation, a traumatizing event, in that it cannot be symbolized, alphabetized. It is undergone. It is blinding. If you take that hymn that says, I once, Amazing Grace, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, I once was lost and now I'm found, was blind but now I can see. In Church of the Contradiction, we've turned that around and we say, I once was found but now I'm lost, could see and now I'm blind. There's something in the mystical tradition that would take that on, that there is not a blinding light, but a blinding night. And it's a kind of revelatory darkness. A very beautiful understanding, and if you read someone like Rudolf Otto, it's very, very beautiful description. So in this approach, when you have God, the name God is a name for that which cannot be named, right? In this mystical tradition, and Anselm is key, Anselm defines God, the signifier God, as a signifier that defines what is beyond signification. And that's what's called a master signifier. Similar to what we would say about justice and love and freedom, there are these signifiers that signify something that we cannot signify, but basically the biggest master signifier is the word God, because in the very definition of God for Anselm, just like the very definition of a triangle is like three-sided shape or whatever, the very definition of God is that which is beyond our ability to conceive. And Anselm's argument why is because if you could conceive of something greater than God, like God is that which you cannot conceive of greater, right? So he starts off with that. He says, what is God? Whether you believe in God or not, that signifier references that than which none higher can be thought or conceived. And then he says, so if you can conceive of something greater than conception, and God is conceivable, and you're thinking about something greater than God, and that's impossible. God is that than which none greater can be conceived. So he says God must be that which is greater than conception, because that's the greatest thing you can think of. The greatest thing I can think of is something beyond my ability to think. Anyway, that is actually, in the tradition of the mystics. Pseudo-Dionysius and others have this notion of God. Anselm was just the one who put it into the most systematic form in the Proslogion. So you have that notion of God. Then you have the notion of religious experience as the overwhelming saturation of the mind and the body by this, and say in Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy, I think he says at the start of that book, if you haven't had this experience, you're not going to enjoy the book, right? So don't bother, and that's quite a mystical approach, which is not arguing for or against the existence of God, but rather going like, have you had this counter experience or not? For people who have had the counter experience, they probably cannot help but think that they have encountered something that is greater than being, right? And if you haven't had it, then you're probably not, right? So the mystics don't really go in for the kind of philosophical arguments for or against God. So this experience is one that happens very occasionally to some people, and maybe it happens to everybody occasionally, that you feel overwhelmed in this way. It's not just being overwhelmed by a beautiful piece of art or by an event that is like a sinking of the Titanic, if you're on it, like it's an overwhelming event. This is overwhelming in a multitude of ways. And Jean-Luc Marion uses Kant to say that Kant basically outlined a series of categories that everything is filtered through, called quantity, quality, relationality, and modality. These are the four kind of like categories that everything that we encounter goes through these four filters. And basically Marion says the religious experience overwhelms all four, right? That's the argument. Then you can go look it up, talk to ChatGPT about it. Very good. I've been doing that recently. ChatGPT is quite impressive these days. So religious experience happens occasionally, and it's a sublime experience in that Kantian sense of being overwhelmed. And then a religious liturgy would be one that invites this encounter. So I think the charismatic church is an example of this in a way, is like where you invite this overwhelming counter experience to occur, and the results should be, humility and desire to go into the world or whatever. Right? So that's one, and I connect that loosely with demand, in that there is an object, God, now a hyper object, but that can meet us and can kind of satisfy us in some way. The reason why I hesitate is because someone like Jean-Luc Marion would say that because it's a saturated phenomenon, there is a dissatisfaction in it. Like there's a mystery and an unknowingness. So it doesn't quite give you everything, and it gives you too much. And by giving you too much, it evokes doubt and unknowing and longing and yearning. So it's a little bit more complicated, but I still think it's loosely we can call it the religion of demand.